"You can't just waltz in here and claim that, Doc." That's what she screamed, first words out of her mouth before I even knew who the hell she was. I'd barely put down my moving boxes when she marched across my lawn like she owned the zip code, yelling something about community rules and access rights. No hello, no introduction, just pure entitlement. Like my property was some shared toy she didn't want me touching, and the way her little clipboard army flanked her, something was definitely off. Let me know in the comments if you've ever met someone like that on day one. I bought this lakeside cabin thinking I could finally escape the corporate drama that had been eating me alive for 3 years. It's 38 years old, burned out from managing logistics for a shipping company, and desperate for somewhere quiet to decompress on weekends. The realtor showed me this place on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and I knew immediately it was perfect. Weathered cedar siding, stone fireplace, and best of all, my own private wooden pier stretching 50 feet into the crystal-clear water of Lake Harrison. The seller's paperwork was straightforward. Inspection came back clean, and I closed on the property 3 weeks later with cash from my retirement fund. The whole process felt like the first smart decision I had made in years. Moving day started at 7 o'clock in the morning. I was feeling optimistic as I loaded boxes from my truck onto the covered porch. The air smelled like pine needles and lake. Water. Exactly what I needed after years of breathing recycled office air. I had just carried my first load inside when I heard voices coming from the direction of my pier. Looking out the kitchen window, I could see 3 people walking down my dock like they owned it. A woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair was leading the group, holding a stack of laminated documents and gesturing dramatically at the water. Behind her, a stocky man in khakis and a polo shirt was nodding along while jotting notes in a small pad, and a third person I could not quite make out was trailing behind them. My first thought was that maybe they were neighbors coming to introduce themselves, but something about their body language told me this was not a social visit. I walked outside to see what was happening, still wearing my old moving clothes and feeling completely unprepared for whatever this was going to be. The woman with the stack of documents spotted me immediately and marched up the slope toward my cabin with the kind of determined stride that meant trouble. "You must be the new owner," she called out, in a tone that suggested this was not going to be a friendly welcome. "I'm Victoria Hale, president of the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your pier situation right away." The man behind her introduced himself as Clark Benson, some kind of HOA enforcement officer, and I could already tell from his smug expression that he was enjoying this encounter way too much. The third person turned out to be another board member, whose name I immediately forgot because I was too busy trying to figure out what they wanted from me. Victoria did not waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She shuffled through her documents and started reading from what looked like a prepared speech about community dock access and shared marina resources. According to her, my private pier was actually considered community property under the HOA covenants, and I needed to surrender control of it immediately so they could implement their new Marina Pass system. We're planning to sell seasonal dock privileges to residents for $200 each, she explained as if this was perfectly reasonable. Your pier is the main access point to the marina, so we'll need you to remove any private property signs and allow community members to use it freely. Clark jumped in to add that failure to comply would result in daily fines starting at $50 and escalating from there. I honestly could not believe what I was hearing, but I kept my mouth shut and let them talk. I listened to their entire presentation without saying a word, which seemed to make Victoria increasingly agitated. She kept shuffling through papers on her stack, pulling out copies of documents that looked like they had been photocopied multiple times, each one more blurry than the last. When she finished talking, she looked at me expectantly. "So, what's your answer?" she asked, a smirk playing on her lips. I looked from her smug face to Clark's, and then back down at the blurred pages. "Can you show me the deed that proves this?" "Pier belongs to the HOA," I asked calmly. Victoria's expression shifted immediately, and she started talking about covenant interpretations and community standards instead of providing any actual legal documentation. Clark tried to intimidate me by mentioning inspections and violation notices, but I just kept asking the same question over and over. I wasn't trying to be difficult. but I had just spent a fortune on this property, and I was not about to hand over part of it based on photocopied papers and verbal threats. The whole conversation felt surreal, like I had stepped into some kind of alternate reality where random people could just show up and demand your property. I pulled out my phone and started recording, which made all three of them visibly uncomfortable. Victoria immediately started talking about privacy rights and inappropriate documentation, which struck me as pretty ironic coming from someone who was standing on my private dock making mints. I told them I would need to review any legal documents they had before discussing anything further, and that seemed to end the conversation abruptly. They walked back down my pier in a tight cluster, talking in low voices and shooting glances. Back at my cabin, could hear Victoria's voice getting louder as they got farther away, but I could not make out the specific words she was using. After they left, I stood on my porch trying to process what had just happened. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old brass key that had come with the property, something the previous owner had mentioned casually during the closing. "You'll figure out what it opens," he had said with a knowing smile.
Ow.
But I had been too focused on the paperwork to ask for details. Staring at this key in the afternoon sunlight, I wondered if there was more to this property than I had realized. The metal was tarnished but solid, with intricate markings that looked like they had been carved by hand decades ago. There were symbols I could not identify, including what looked like an anchor and some kind of directional arrow. Whatever this key opened, it was clearly important enough for the previous owner to make sure it stayed with the property. The more I thought about Victoria's demands, the more something felt off about the whole situation. If my pier was really community property, why had the previous owner been allowed to keep it private for so many years? And why were they so desperate to get control of it right now? Just as I was moving in, I walked down to the end of my pier and placed the key on the wooden railing just to see if Victoria and her crew were still watching from somewhere in the community. The brass caught the light and gleamed against the weathered wood, and I found myself muttering under my breath as I picked it up again. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I had a feeling this old key was going to be more important than anyone realized. Hope you know what this opens. I woke up at 5:30 the next morning to the sound of someone hammering on my front door. Still half asleep, I stumbled out of bed and peered through the peephole to see Clark Benson, standing on my porch with a stack of official-looking papers in his hand. He was dressed like he was heading to a business meeting, complete with a tie and dress shoes, which seemed ridiculous for dawn enforcement duties at a lake community. I opened the door just enough to take the papers he was trying to serve me, and he immediately launched into a speech about violation notice and inspection schedules. "These citations are effective immediately," he announced, as if he was some kind of law enforcement officer, instead of just an busybody with too much time on his hands. I wanted to ask him if he had nothing better to do at 5:30 in the morning, but I was too tired to start an argument. The papers he handed me were laughably amateur, printed on standard copy. Paper with clip art borders and fonts that looked like they came from a 1990s word processing program. The first notice accused me of unauthorized private signage because of the small private pier sign the previous owner had installed near the dock. The second citation was for failure to register watercraft access equipment, which I think meant my pier, though the language was so vague it could have applied to anything. The third and most bizarre violation was for non-compliance with community Marina integration protocols, which sounded completely made up. Each citation carried a $50 daily fine, and Clark made sure to tell me that thefts would double every week until I came into compliance. I asked him where these protocols were written down, and he just gestured to his briefcase like that was supposed to be an answer. What bothered me most was not the ridiculous paperwork, but the way my neighbors had started acting since Victoria's visit yesterday. The woman who lived in the blue cottage across the street used to wave when she saw me outside. But this morning, she suddenly found her phone very interesting when I walked to my mailbox. An older man who had introduced himself during my first week here now seemed to be avoiding eye contact entirely. I could see people having conversations on their porches that stopped abruptly when I came into view. And I started to realize that Victoria had been busy spreading her version of events around the community. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if there really was a coordinated campaign to make me feel unwelcome. But either way, it was working. The whole situation was starting to feel like high school all over again, except the mean kids had official looking papers and legal threats. Instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for myself, I decided to do some research. I pulled up satellite images of the property on my laptop and started comparing them to the local county property maps I found online. That's when I discovered something interesting. There was a misfiled lot line overlay that showed my property extending much further into the lake than I had originally thought. The boundaries on the official county website didn't match what Victoria had been claiming, and they certainly didn't support her assertion that my pier was somehow community property. I sketched out the dock dimensions on a notepad cross, referencing them with the satellite imagery. And the more I studied the layout, the more convinced I became that something was fundamentally wrong with the US's version of property boundaries. I started pacing around the cabin, trying to piece together what I was seeing. But I couldn't quite understand the significance of what I had found. I decided to take a walk around the property to see if I could find any physical evidence that would help me understand the boundary discrepancies. Following the tree line behind my cabin, I discovered a narrow path that led down to the water's edge about 100 yards east of my pier. Hidden among the tall grass and cattails, I found something that made me stop and stare, an old boundary marker almost completely obscured by decades-off vegetation growth. The metal post was rusty and tilted at an odd angle, but I could still make out carved symbols that matched the markings on the brass key I had found yesterday. I had to pull away several years' worth of vines and weeds to get a clear view of the marker. But it was definitely there, and it was positioned in a direct line with my pier. I pulled out my phone and took several photos of the boundary marker, from different angles, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates displayed on my screen. The symbols carved into the metal were clearly handmade, not mash and stamped, and they looked like they predated the HOA by several decades. One symbol looked like an anchor, another resembled a key, and the third appeared to be some kind of compass or directional indicator. As I studied the markings more closely, a memory surfaced from my closing conversation with Frank Morrison. He had mentioned casually that the HOA had always hated him for something they couldn't prove, but he had never elaborated on what that meant. Now, looking at this boundary marker and thinking about the brass key he had left me, I was starting to understand that there was a much deeper history to this property dispute than anyone had told me. On my way back to the cabin, I ran into Harold Green, an older gentleman who lived in one of the original cottages near the community entrance. Harold had to be pushing 70 with the kind of deep tan and weathered hands that come from decades of outdoor work. And he had always struck me as someone who knew the history of this place better than anyone else. He was pulling weeds from his flower garden when I walked by, and he glanced up with the careful expression of someone who wanted to talk but was not sure if it was safe. "Morning, Derek," he said quietly, then looked around to make sure no one else was within earshot.
"Heard.
"You had some visitors yesterday." The way he said it made me think he had probably watched the whole confrontation from his garden. I wondered how much of the community drama he had witnessed over the years. Harold's revelation came out in fragments, like he was testing the water before diving in completely. According to him, the HOA had been gradually redefining property boundaries for years, claiming private docks and waterfront access points as community amenities to justify collecting additional fees from residents. Used to be everyone understood. Where their property ended and the community property began, he explained, still keeping his voice low. But Victoria has been creative with the interpretations, especially when it comes to anything that touches the water. He mentioned that several other homeowners had been pressured to surrender private dock rights in exchange for reduced assent, and that the association had been talking about implementing a Marina pass system for months now. I asked him if anyone had ever challenged these reinterpretations legally, and he just shook his head with the resigned expression of someone who had seen too many battles lost. The most interesting part of Harold's story was his memory of the previous owner of my cabin, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who had lived there for over 30 years before moving to a retirement community last spring. According to Harold, Frank had always insisted that his pier and waterfront access were completely separate from the HOA's jurisdiction, and he had the paperwork to prove it. Frank used to say he had documentation going back to the original lake development in the 1960s. Harold recalled. Always carried this old brass key with him. Claimed it proved something important about property rights around here. When I mentioned that Frank had left me a similar key, Harold's eyes widened, and he suggested I might want to do some research into the original property surveys. He also warned me that Victoria had been particularly frustrated by Frank's refusal to cooperate, and that she was probably seeing my arrival as a fresh opportunity to finally get control of that pier. Suddenly, I knew this wasn't about rule violations. It was about ownership. The community meeting notice appeared in my mailbox on Thursday afternoon, printed on official letterhead with my name prominently featured under a section. It's titled Property Violations and Community Standards. Review. Victoria had wasted no time scheduling this public tribunal, and from the formal language in the announcement, she clearly expected this to be my final humiliation before surrendering the pier. The meeting was set for Saturday evening at the clubhouse, a rustic building thought overlooked. The Marina entrance with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a perfect view of my contested dock. I spent Friday night reviewing every document for my property purchase, looking for anything that might help me understand what I was really dealing with. The more I studied the paperwork, the more questions I had about the relationship between my pier and the larger marina system. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of unseasonably warm weather that brings everyone out of their cabins, and I could see residents making their way toward the clubhouse in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. The building was packed. By the time I arrived with folding chairs arranged in neat rows, facing a table where Victoria and 3 other board members sat with stacks of documents spread out in front of them, Clark was positioned near the door like some kind of security guard, checking off names on his official-looking forms as people entered. The atmosphere felt more like a trial than a community meeting. An EGOT, the distinct impression that I was supposed to be the defendant in this proceeding. I found an empty seat near the back and tried to blend in, but every conversation seemed to stop when people noticed me walking by. Victoria called the meeting to order with the kind of theatrical authority that suggested she had been practicing. This moment all week, she began by reading a prepared statement about the importance of community cooperation and shared resources, emphasizing how individual property owners had a responsibility to consider the greater good when making decisions about waterfront access. Then she launched into what could only be described as a character assassination, listing off a series of alleged violations and community disruptions that painted me as some kind of troublemaker, who had arrived with the sole purpose of undermining the HOA's authority. According to Victoria's version of events, I had been hostile and uncooperative from the moment she tried to welcome me to the community, refusing to engage in good faith discussions about peer sharing arrangements. The most infuriating part of her presentation was how she twisted our previous interactions to make herself look reasonable and me look stubborn. She described her initial visit to my cabin as a friendly attempt to explain community policies, conveniently leaving out the part where she had demanded immediate surrender of my property without providing any legal documentation. She made Clark's Dawn citation delivery sound like a routine administrative procedure rather than an obvious intimidation tactic designed to pressure me into compliance. When she finished reading her list of grievances, she opened the floor for community input, and I could see several residents shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they realized they were being asked to take sides in a dispute they probably did not fully understand. A few people spoke up in support of Victoria's position, mostly repeating talking points about community cooperation and shared sacrifice. One woman complained, "Then I would give the residents a chance to experience my pier firsthand and draw their own conclusions about who was really looking out for their interests." I spent Saturday afternoon preparing for what I decided to call an open dock community event, though I knew Victoria would probably have a different name for it. I strung solar-powered lights along the length of the pier, set up a folding table with snacks and drinks, and dragged my portable grill down to the dock area for an impromptu barbecue. The setup looked casual and inviting, exactly the opposite of the formal, intimidating atmosphere that seemed to follow Victoria wherever she went. I printed up simple flyers explaining that I wanted to give neighbors a chance to enjoy the pier and learn more about the property boundaries, and I made sure to deliver them to every cabin in the community except for Victoria's and Clark's. First guests started arriving around 6 p.m., led by a single mom named Megan Price, who lived in one of the smaller cabins near the community entrance with her 2 young kids. Megan had always struck me as someone who was struggling to make ends meet while raising her children alone. And I got the impression that the HOA's proposed marina fees would be a real financial hardship for her family. She brought her kids, aged about 8 and 10, who immediately started asking questions about the fish they could see swimming around the pier pilings. "We've never actually been out on a dock like this," Megan confessed, watching her children lean over the railing to get a better look at the water. The HOA always made it sound like private piers were off limits to families like ours. Davia, ever watch kids discover something magical for the first time? That pure joy was exactly what I needed to remember why I was fighting this battle. As more people arrived, Megan found herself in the center of a heated discussion about HOA enforcement tactics. "Clark told me my kayak rack was a safety hazard," she said, making direct eye contact with me as she spoke. "They threatened to fine me weekly. I'm a single mom. Where was I supposed to put it? Garage is barely big enough for my car, and they won't let me store it anywhere else on the property." And her story triggered similar complaints from other residents who had been targeted by Victoria's enforcement campaigns. I could see that people were starting to understand that this was not really about community safety or property values. Harold Green arrived with his wife, a quiet woman who rarely spoke at community meetings, but seemed genuinely curious about the pier structure and how it connected to the larger marina system. By 7:30, I had at least 20 people enjoying my pier, and the atmosphere was relaxed and friendly in a way that reminded me why I had wanted to move to a lake community in the first place. Everyone was asking questions about the property boundaries and the history of the pier. I found myself sharing what I had learned from Harold and my lawyer friend about the original development plans. It's the most interesting conversation of the evening happened when several residents started comparing notes about the HOA's financial management and fee structure. Apparently, Victoria had been talking about the Marina Repair Fund for months, claiming that major infrastructure improvements were needed to maintain safe water access for the community. According to the official budget documents, the HOA had collected over $50,000 specifically for marina maintenance and dock repairs. But nobody could point to any actual improvements that had been made with that money. "The same docks have been rotting for 3 years," complained a man who owned a small fishing boat. "We keep paying special assessments for repairs that never happen. And now they want to charge us $200 each for marina passes on top of our regular dues." Megan was the one who finally said what everyone else was thinking. She stood up on my pier, with her kids beside her, looking back toward the community center where Victoria probably lived, and spoke in a voice that carried across the water. "Do not turn our marina into an ATM machine," she declared loud enough for anyone within a quarter mile to hear clearly. "We already pay high dues for community maintenance. We should not have to pay again for access to something our dues are supposed to cover." Her words triggered a round of applause from the other families on the pier, and I could see people nodding in agreement as they started to understand that this was not really about my pier at all. Victoria was using my property as a convenient excuse to implement a fee system that would generate revenue for purposes that were not being clearly explained to the community. The party was winding down around 9:00 p.m. when Clark Benson appeared at the edge of my property, standing just beyond the tree line, where he thought he could observe without being noticed. I could see him taking photos of the crowd on my pier and tapping on his phone. It's probably documenting HOA violations and community disturbances for another round of citations. Several of the residents noticed him too, and I could tell from their expressions that they were starting to understand how closely their activities were being monitored by the HOA enforcement team. When Clark realized he had been spotted, he retreated back toward the community center, but not before taking one more photo of the families enjoying my docander, the string lights. As my guests were packing up to leave, Harold pulled me aside, with the kind of serious expression that meant important information was about to be shared. "Frank fought the HOA once," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "Took them to court quietly, won, but the board never forgave him." He also mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He had seen Victoria at the marina years ago, marking something with red tape, which connected her directly to the boundary manipulations I was starting to uncover. The last family was walking back toward the community center when I turned off the string lights and surveyed The success of my impromptu gathering. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I had actually connected with my neighbors in a positive way, and several people had specifically thanked me for giving them access to a part of the waterfront they had never experienced before. But as I was cleaning up the grill and folding chairs, I noticed an official-looking envelope that had been slipped under my front door while I was busy hosting the party. Inside was a notice from Victoria announcing a mandatory community inspection, scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., with specific focus on unauthorized gatherings and safety. Violations related to unsupervised waterfront activities. The timing was clearly not a coincidence. But Harold wasn't done. He leaned closer and whispered, "You might want to check the land deeds again." Frank left more behind than just docks. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, kind of weather. That makes everything look dreary and uninviting, which seemed appropriate for what I expected to be the final confrontation with Victoria and the HOA board. The mandatory inspection notice had specified 8 a.m. sharp at the community center, and I could see residents making their way across the wet pavement with the reluctant expressions of people who had better things to do, but were afraid of the consequences of not showing up. I had spent Sunday evening organizing every document related to my property purchase, including the new information my lawyer friend had uncovered about exclusive easements and waterfront rights. Victoria sat at the head table with Clark and 2 other board members, surrounded by bankers' boxes full of documents and legal files that were obviously intended to intimidate anyone who might be thinking of challenging their authority. Clark had set up an easel with a large diagram that appeared to be some kind of property map. Though from my seat in the back, I could not make out the details clearly. The whole setup felt like a courtroom with Victoria positioned as the judge and jury, while the residents were relegated to the role of silent observers. Victoria began the meeting by reading from a thick folder of what she claimed were official HOA bylaws and community covenants. According to her interpretation of these documents, private waterfront structures like my pier fell under community jurisdiction whenever they were deemed essential for Marina operations and resident safety. She produced faded copies from various legal sources citing property law precedents and municipal regulations that supposedly supported her position. The presentation was impressive in its scope and complexity, but I noticed that all of her documentation consisted of poor quality reproductions rather than original documents, and none of the papers she displayed had official county seals or certification stamps. When I asked to examine the original bylaws that she was quoting from, she claimed that the official documents were stored in a secure location for protection purposes. Clark's contribution to the presentation focused on immediate safety concerns and compliance requirements. He flipped through his easel diagram, pointing to different areas of the marina and explaining how my pier was supposedly creating navigation hazards and blocking emergency access routes that were essential for community safety. According to his analysis, my refusal to allow community access was creating liability issues that put the entire HOA at risk of lawsuits and insurance complications. He produced a folder full of inspection reports and safety evaluations that painted my pier as a dangerous obstruction that needed to be brought under community control immediately. When I asked who had conducted these inspections and when they had been performed, Clark became evasive and started talking about professional standards and certified evaluation procedures. Anyone else ever notice how people get vague when you ask for specifics? That's usually when Yauk know they're bluffing. The most dramatic moment of the meeting came when Victoria announced that the HOA had retained legal counsel and was prepared to file a lawsuit to force compliance with community Marina integration requirements. She produced a letter from a law firm threatening immediate court action if I did not sign a pier access agreement by the end of the week. The lawyer's letter was filled with intimidating language about property seizure and financial penalties. But when I asked to see the specific legal authority that would allow the HOA to take my property, Victoria started talking about eminent domain and community welfare considerations. The whole presentation felt like an elaborate bluff designed to scare me into submission. But the threat of actual litigation made clear that this conflict had reached a point where someone was going to have to back down or face serious legal consequences. I let Victoria and Clark finish their entire presentation before standing up to respond. I had been taking notes throughout their presentation, I had identified several inconsistencies and questionable claims that deserved closer examination. Instead of getting defensive or emotional, I decided to respond with the same kind of methodical approach that had served me well in my logistics career. I unfolded 3 old deeds on the table in front of me and handed copies to each board member, making sure everyone in the room could see what I was doing. "These aren't just historical documents," I said clearly, looking directly at Victoria. "They're enforceable, signed, sealed, and unrevoked." The legal documentation I was presenting showed ownership not just of the pier, but of the submerged land around the marina, which gave me exclusive control over water access in ways that Victoria clearly had not anticipated. The chain of title documents I presented showed a clear lineage of ownership for my pier and waterfront access area going back to the original lake development in the 1960s. Unlike Victoria's blurred bylaws, my documentation consisted of original survey reports with official county seals and recorded deed transfers with notarized signatures. I explained the legal concept of exclusive easements in simple terms that everyone in the room could understand, emphasizing that these rights had been established decades before the current HOA leadership had taken control. When Victoria tried to interrupt with questions about community precedents and covenant interpretations, I calmly pointed out that recorded easements override HOA bylaws in all property disputes, and that this was settled law in every state in the country. The most powerful moment of my presentation came when I displayed the waterline survey that showed the exact boundaries of my exclusive access area. The GPS coordinates matched perfectly with the boundary marker I had discovered behind my cabin, and the legal description included specific references to marina maintenance, responsibilities, and liability insurance coverage. When I asked Victoria to explain how the HOA planned to provide alternative public access if they took control of my pier, she went completely silent for the first time since I had met her. Instead of addressing my question, she snapped, "You had no right to access those files," which implied that she thought the records were hidden or sealed. Clark made things worse by blurting out, "You said no one would find those folders," which publicly exposed their collusion and made it clear that they had been deliberately hiding information from the community. The meeting began to fall apart when several residents started asking their own questions about the marina repair fund and the financial justification for the proposed pier seizure. Megan Price spoke up from the middle of the room, pointing out that nobody had seen any actual marina improvements. Despite months of special assessments and repair fund contributions, a woman in the back stood up and said, "You tried to find my father for painting his mailbox blue. You were never even legitimate." Victoria tried to regain control by threatening to end the meeting. The residents were not ready to stop, asking questions about where their money had been going. I closed my document folder and stood up to address the room one final time. The evidence I had presented was clear and comprehensive, but I could see that Victoria was already planning her next move to avoid dealing with the legal reality of my property rights. As I packed up my materials and prepared to leave, I realized that this meeting had served its purpose of exposing the weakness of the HOA's position. But it had also made it clear that Victoria was not going to give up without a much bigger fight. I silently pulled a final envelope from my folder, one that was labeled clearly enough for everyone nearby to read. Marina title transfer notarized. The room went quiet as people tried to process what they were seeing, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention focused on that envelope. And this is what you never saw. Coming Tuesday evening brought an unexpected twist when Victoria called an emergency community meeting at my pier instead of the usual clubhouse location. The message that appeared in everyone's mailbox was brief but urgent. Final resolution of pier dispute? All residents required to attend. 7:00 p.m. at waterfront property. The change of venue struck me as odd since Victoria had always preferred the formal authority that came with conducting meetings from behind the head table in the community center. Standing out Sidian, my pier would put her at a disadvantage. Or at least that's what I thought until I realized she was probably planning to use the outdoor setting as a dramatic backdrop for whatever final ultimatum she had prepared. The sun was setting behind the pine trees as residents gathered on my dock, creating the kind of golden hour lighting that would have been perfect for a peaceful community gathering if the circumstances had been different. Victoria arrived with Clark and the entire HOA board. Plus, a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as their legal counsel. They had clearly come prepared for battle, carrying briefcases full of documents and wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested this was going to be their final push to seize control of my property. I noticed that more residents had shown up for this meeting than for any previous HOA gathering. It's probably because the outdoor setting and the promise of a final resolution had generated genuine curiosity about how this conflict was going to end. Victoria wasted no time getting to the point. She announced that the HOA's legal team had completed their research and discovered that my pier was indeed subject to community control under maritime access regulations that superseded individual property rights. According to their lawyer, my continued refusal to allow community access constituted interference with established navigational easements, and they were prepared to file for immediate injunctive relief if I did not surrender the pier voluntarily. The lawyer stepped forward with a thick folder of legal documents, explaining that they had documentation proving the pier's status as a community asset dating back to the original development permits from the county planning office. He gave me exactly 5 minutes to review their evidence and make a decision about signing the access agreement they had prepared. I opened the folder they handed me and pretended to study the documents carefully, though I already knew what I was going to find. Their evidence consisted of the same flimsy bylaws and reinterpreted covenants that Victoria had been waving around for weeks, along with some official-looking forms that claimed to establish community jurisdiction over waterfront structures. The county planning permits were genuine documents, but they referred to general marina development rather than specific pier ownership. They contained several key details that Victoria and her lawyer had apparently overlooked. When my 5 minutes were up, I closed the folder and walked to the center of the pier where everyone could see me clearly. "Before I respond to your legal threats," I said, looking directly at Victoria and then addressing the crowd, "I'm going to ask you a simple question, which I'm sure your lawyer here can answer. Does your claim to this pier, which you've stated as a community asset, include any of the submerged land beneath it?" Victoria looked nervous, and her lawyer's expression was a blank mask. He seemed to be weighing his options before answering. "No," he said slowly and deliberately. "The HOA's claim is based on surface rights and covenants, not on the underlying property. That's a matter for the county." I nodded. "Exactly." I then reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the sealed envelope, the one that everyone had seen me with at the last meeting. The weight of the moment was palpable. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document, a deed transfer dated from last spring that showed the sale of the entire Lakeview Marina from Morrison Holdings, LLC to my own property management company. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd told me that this information was completely new to everyone except Harold, who was nodding slowly, like he had suspected something like this all along. I continued reading from the deed, explaining that Frank Morrison had not just owned the pier and cabin he sold to me, but had actually owned every dockbow slip and water access point in the entire marina system for over 30 years. The second document was even more damaging to Victoria's position. It wasn't a liability insurance contract that showed the HOA had been paying me monthly premiums for marina maintenance and emergency coverage since the day I closed on the property, per easement code for 2B and state-recognized boundary rights. This land is exempt from HOA jurisdiction, I explained using the legal terminology naturally as I read from the documents. According to the insurance paperwork, the community association had been classified as a tenant organization with limited rights to coordinate resident access, but with no ownership claims or management authority over the actual marina infrastructure. Victoria's face went completely white as I read the insurance details aloud, and I could see her lawyer frantically flipping through his own documents, looking for some way to contradict what I was revealing. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Megan stepped forward and said, "You let her bully us." All this time, we had no idea we were being lied to about who actually owned what. Harold raised a finger and declared, "I warned them years ago that Frank had legal protections they couldn't touch. Now the truth is out." 2 residents who had previously voted with the HOA during community meetings approached me and apologized publicly for not questioning Victoria's authority sooner. Residents who had been supporting Victoria's position suddenly started asking, pointed questions about why they had never been told about the insurance payments and the true ownership structure of the marina. Harold's wife, who had never spoken at a community meeting before, asked why the board had been collecting marina repair funds for a facility they did not own or control. Victoria tried to maintain her composure, but I could see panic setting in as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. One of the board members, who was not Clark, quietly walked away from the group and threw their identification badge on the pier decking, apparently unwilling to be associated with the deception any longer. Victoria tried to speak again, claiming that there had been misunderstandings about the legal documentation. But she was interrupted by someone in the crowd who had started live streaming the meeting on their phone. "Keep talking. Recording everything," the resident called out, which made Victoria go silent immediately. Clark made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation by claiming that the easement documents were forgeries and that my lawyer friend had manufactured false evidence to support my position. This accusation was so obviously ridiculous that several residents actually laughed out loud, and I could see that even Victoria was embarrassed by her enforcer's desperation. I responded by offering to provide certified copies of all documents to anyone who wanted to verify their authenticity, and I invited the HOA's lawyer to contact the county recorder's office if he had any questions about the legal validity of my paperwork. The lawyer quietly gathered his materials and left without another word, apparently realizing that his clients had provided him with fundamentally false information about the legal basis for their case. As the meeting was breaking up, I made an offer that I had been thinking about since Saturday's Pier party. Instead of dealing with HOA fees and bureaucratic complications, I proposed to establish direct agreements with individual residents who wanted marina access, bypassing the association entirely and eliminating the $200 seasonal fees that Victoria had been planning to implement. And as the crowd parted to let me through, someone whispered, "You saved this place." I didn't respond. I just walked toward the dock that was finally and fully mine. Wednesday morning brought news that Victoria had submitted her resignation as HOA president effective immediately, along with formal resignation letters from Clark and to other board members. The announcement arrived in everyone's mailbox, printed on what had been the HOA's official stationery. But the tone was completely different from Victoria's usual authoritative proclamations. Instead of detailed explanations and legal justifications, the resignation letter was brief and defensive, citing irreconcilable differences regarding community leadership philosophy and external pressure that has made effective governance impossible. Reading between the lines, it was clear that Victoria's support among the residents had evaporated completely once they learned the truth about marina ownership and the questionable financial management that had been hidden from public view. Harold Green was elected as interim HOA president at an emergency meeting that evening, and his first official act was to call for a comprehensive audit of all community finances dating back 3 years. The accounting firm he hired specializes in forensic investigation of nonprofit organizations, and their preliminary findings were even more damaging than I had expected. According to their initial report, the HOA's Marina Repair Fund had received over $120,000 in special assessments and maintenance fees since Victoria took office, but only about $30,000 could be accounted for in legitimate marina-related expenses. The rest of the money had been classified under vague categories like administrative consulting and emergency infrastructure planning, which appeared to be code words for personal expenditures and unauthorized budget transfers. The forensic audit revealed a pattern of financial mismanagement that extended far beyond the Marina Fund controversy. Victoria had been using HOA credit cards for personal purchases, including restaurant meals, vacation expenses, and home improvement, projects that had nothing to do with community business. Clark had been receiving monthly payments from the Association for Security Consulting Services. Despite having no professional qualifications or licensing in security management, the other board members had approved these expenditures without proper documentation or oversight, apparently trusting Victoria's explanations about necessary community investments. The legal consequences came swiftly once the audit results became public. The county prosecutor's office opened a criminal investigation into embezzlement and misuse of community funds, and Victoria was served with papers demanding immediate restitution of over $90,000 in unauthorized expenditures. Clark faced similar restitution demands, plus potential charges for intimidation and harassment related to the anonymous threats and property vandalism that had been traced back to him through cell phone records and witness testimony. Lawyer withdrew from the case, entirely claiming that he had been provided with false information about the legal basis for the Pier dispute. The most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal came when I received an official apology letter from the new HOA board acknowledging that my property rights had been violated and that the association's previous leadership had acted without legal authority. The letter included a formal request for me to consider entering into a Marina access agreement that would benefit the community while respecting my exclusive easement rights. I agreed to the proposal immediately, but with terms that reflected the true ownership structure rather than the fictional community control that Victoria had been trying to establish. Under the new agreement, residents could use the Marina facilities free of charge in exchange for participating in volunteer maintenance activities and following basic safety guidelines. The transformation of community attitudes was remarkable. Once everyone understood the real situation, families who had been avoiding me for weeks suddenly started waving when they saw me outside. And several people apologized for believing Victoria's version of events without asking for my side of the story. Megan Price became one of my strongest supporters, organizing weekend cleanup activities and coordinating the volunteer that kept the Marina facilities in better condition than they had been in years. Harold's institutional memory proved invaluable for establishing maintenance procedures that respected both the historical development of the property and the practical needs of current residents. 6 months later, the Marina access system was running more smoothly than anyone could remember. The volunteer maintenance program had attracted enthusiastic participation from residents, who appreciated having a direct voice in managing the facilities they used regularly. The elimination of seasonal fees had made lake access affordable for families who had been priced out under Victoria's proposed system. And the transparent management structure ensured that all decisions were made with full community input. I installed a new sign at the entrance to my pier that read "Community Access by Owner Permission," placing the old private pier warning with language that reflected the cooperative spirit we had established. Standing on my pier at sunset, watching families laugh and cast lines from docks that were once battlegrounds, I couldn't help but smile. Not out of pride, but relief. The wind off the lake carried more than just summer air. It carried proof that this fight had been worth it. I opened the camera app, ready to capture what peace looks like after months of chaos, and before hitting record, I reached into my pocket and ran my fingers over the old brass key, Frank's key. Maybe the real lesson here is that some things aren't meant to be controlled. They're meant to be cared for, then passed on. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever had to stand your ground over something bigger than yourself. And hey, if this story hit home in you, want to help the channel grow? You can always tap that little thanks button below. Take care of your corner of the world. Somebody just might need it more than you know. Appreciate you sticking with us at QA Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment, because things only get crazier from here.